Welcome back, everybody. I hope you've had a nice break. Thank you so much for all the questions you've sent in to us. We had, lots to look through, and we're really looking forward to putting John rather on the spot.
Well, John, you've certainly caused quite a bit of debate, and we've had lots of questions, as Joe's just said. So I'm going to kick off. We've tried to group your questions, so we apologise if you don't hear exact words, but with so many questions, we've tried to get them into themes. So we'll hope we do our best. John, how do you respond to the objection that Newton, Kepler, etc., only believed in God because they were taught in institutions run by the church, and everyone traditionally believed in God in those days? Your starter for 10.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me just say that this is a Q&A, so you're bound to be disappointed. The reason for that is this: I can simply react to the questions and tell you how I would begin to think about them. But that's not a bad thing, because if your question that you asked is a genuine question and not just simply being asked to test what I know, you'll soon realize I know relatively little. But if it's a genuine question, then the far more important thing is that when you go home and you're not satisfied with what I say, that you will do the work to get a satisfactory answer to your question, and it'll live with you for the rest of your life. So it's an inadequate process. I will try and keep my answers short, and they will be, by definition, inadequate. Now, the question about Newton and Kepler and so on, it is the fact that in the Europe of the 15th and 16th centuries, the general worldview was theistic. But you see, the way the question is phrased reminds me of Richard Dawkins asking the very same question. Everyone believed in God in the world. That is not true. Dawkins had forgotten China, for instance. And the interesting thing here is, one, that yes, there was a Christian theistic background in Europe, and that's what educated Newton and co. But the argument that somehow there's no real connection between the rise of science and the Christian background is rather rendered negative by the fact that there was one person who was puzzled by the fact that science, in the sense of abstract science, never developed among the Chinese. Technology, yes, printing, fireworks, and so on. But there was an expert on China, spoke fluent Chinese, and his name was Joseph Needham. He was a chemist. He wrote the Standard Dictionary on Chinese technology. And interestingly, he was a neo-Marxist in his philosophy, and he tried for some years to explain within an atheist paradigm why it was the Chinese never developed the natural sciences as happened in the West. But he came to this conclusion. He said, I can only see it in the fact that the Chinese lacked the concept of a single creator who had created the universe to run according to laws that he had designed. So it's documented there. So it is not the fact that everybody believed in God. And it's also demonstrable that the natural sciences did arise in that part of the world that believed in God. And thirdly, it stands in one sense to reason that what theism, biblical theism, gave to these people was the concept that this is a rational universe and therefore science can be done. It fits together perfectly. And in fact, this thesis has been developed by John Hidley-Brooke, for example, with whom I worked in Oxford, and his successor, who actually argues that the rise of science was not simply due to Christian theism and monotheism. It was due in part to the changed attitude of the reformers towards the understanding of Scripture, in that they were prepared to approach the Bible and let it speak for itself, instead of imposing on it methods of allegorical interpretation. And so they said, let's do the same with the universe. Let's go and see what the universe says.
Now, John, in order to win a one-way trip to the Vatican, here's the next question. Does Christianity not stifle scientific discoveries, as in the case of Galileo and the Catholic Church? And why did the Catholic Church feel it necessary to persecute Christian scientists like Galileo and Copernicus?
Well, the history of this is utterly fascinating. If you want a good read at Christmas, try reading Galileo's Daughter by Dava Sobel. You see, the interesting thing is, this is an iconic story. It's used all the time to show that the attitude of the church, Christianity, towards science was negative and so on. But when you analyze it, it becomes so much more interesting. Firstly, the first people to attack Galileo were not the members of the Catholic Church. They were the philosophers, the Aristotelian philosophers. And they believed that the earth was fixed because that is what Aristotle had taught. It did not move. They were the principal objectors to Galileo claiming it moved. Now, the Catholic Church had jumped on that bandwagon because they found statements in the Bible that they thought supported the idea that the earth did not move. The Lord has set the earth on its pillars, that it should not move. So they jumped on the bandwagon of the bad science of Aristotle. It's very different from science versus faith in God. Thirdly, or secondly, Galileo was not an atheist. He was a believer in God when he started, and he was a believer in God when he finished. And the net result of a great deal of scholarship done on this, and there are amusing things, you know. Galileo was a bit of a rascal, really. He insisted on writing science in Italian rather than Latin, and that offended people. And then, to make matters even worse, he, in one of his famous books, putting forward his views, he had the views of the Pope coming out of the mouth of a character he called Simplicius the Fool, which did not earn him a great welcome in the Vatican, and so on. And the general verdict on that story and on the Huxley-Wilberforce debate given by Colin Russell, an eminent professor of the history of science at our Open University, is these stories keep being used to demonstrate a conflict between science and religion, and the thing that needs to be explained is how they ever came to fulfill that role, because history shows that they do not support it at all. Now, there is, of course, no excuse for the way in which the Catholic Church treated Galileo, and only repented of it recently, but he wasn't persecuted. As far as we know, he lived to the end of his days in luxury provided by his friends. So again, it's an iconic story that does not establish what it's used to establish.
One more question before I hand over to Joe. Do you ever have private conversations with Dawkins, or just public debates? And what about Stephen Hawking? Did he ever respond?
I never really had any private conversations with Richard Dawkins, only very brief. I only met him at the debates. And so the answer to that question is no. And Stephen Hawking, of course, was confined to a wheelchair and speaking through a mechanical device because of his motor neuron disease. So there was no response, and there has been no response to my book raising these questions from any of his colleagues, which I found quite surprising. But there's no question of having a discussion with him, because he could only work at a very slow speed, and everything had to be characterized, had to be laid out before in total text. And I never had that opportunity, I'm afraid.
Joe, over to you.
So some more questions, John. I'll read you the next two. The creation story in Genesis gets the order of events mixed up a bit. How could God have allowed this if it was always going to be scrutinised when science got there? It should be perfect. And then after that, please can you give us your opinion as a mathematician on the role of probability in the theory of evolution? We're told that random chance has played a large part in the natural selection of genes. But how likely is this in your view?
How many hours have you got? Well, let's be brief and just approach this. You see, the assertion is that Genesis gets it mixed up. There's a book called The Genesis Enigma. It's written by a non-theist who is one of the highest placed scientists in our country, who happens to be a friend of mine. And he was giving a talk on bioluminescence in front of a group of journalists who said, "You sound like Genesis." And he thought Genesis was a pop group or something. "What do you mean, Genesis?" They said, "Genesis in the Bible." And he was curious about this. So he went and got a Bible and started reading page 1. And then he read it again. And the result was a book called The Genesis Enigma. He said, "From what I know of science, this is so accurate that what I do not understand is how they knew. And if ever," and I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember the exact quote, "if ever there was a page of literature that would convince me that there is a God, it would be that." Now, what the questioner is probably referring to is that the order of events in Genesis 1 appears on the surface to be different from the order of events as recorded in Genesis 2. But it seems to me that that is very easily understood by remembering that there are different kinds of order. There is chronological order, and Genesis 1 certainly gives an impression of being chronological. There is a sequence. But then there's logical order. For instance, if I'm talking to an architect and builder about a hospital in Birmingham, and I say, "Tell me about the hospital." Well, first we dug a big hole in the ground, and then we put in various basic steel girders that reached to the roof, and then we built a car park, and then we built administration offices, and then we built a ward, and then we built operating theatres above that, and then we built more wards above that, and then the air conditioning and the roof. That's a chronological description. But if I ask the head surgeon of the hospital, "Tell me about your hospital," he's likely to say something like this: "Well, this hospital is very convenient because, you see, in the middle we put the operating theatres, and above them and below them we put the wards, and then of course there's the admin, the car park, and so on." When you hear that description, do you imagine that suddenly the operating theatres appeared in the sky above? Of course you don't. Because you know intuitively how to separate logical order and chronological order. Well, if we do that in our everyday language, surely we're grown up to allow it in the Bible. A lot of the confusions with the Bible are applying to it canons of grammar that we wouldn't apply to any other book. Now, that's a huge topic. And I'm going to do another bit of shameless advertising.
You go for it.
Because I get this kind of question about Genesis so often that I've written a little book about it called 7 Days That Divide the World. The second question was about evolution. I'm not a biologist, although I'm fascinated by biology. And the question is limited to the role of probability, meaning presumably chance, in evolution. Now, of course, you have to step back from this. What is evolution and what does it do? And I'm a mathematical skeptic here. I must confess that straight away. But clearly, mutation and natural selection do something. Just have a look around this room. Why do we all not look the same? Well, thankfully, we don't. But the reason is that there has been selecting. I selected my wife, or at least I think I did. She probably selected me 50 years ago. And that's why our children look as they do. It was selection of a very real type. And most of us are afflicted. I say it that way because they're mostly deleterious, with mutations of which we might eventually die. So natural selection and mutation do something. And clearly there is, from the perspective of analysis, there is a random element in it. I don't find that difficult. And certainly, since we're all different, and I believe that God is behind it, God is behind that. The bigger question is whether the neo-Darwinian theory or its modifications today can support the weight that is put on it. That is, can it support the idea that it creates? And I'm skeptical, very skeptical about that. I don't see the evidence. But the one point I would make about it, ladies and gentlemen, is the greatest confusion comes in the failure to distinguish evolution, whatever it does or doesn't do, and the origin of life. The one thing evolution clearly didn't do was produce life, even though Dawkins has been saying for years that it did. Why? Because evolution, whatever it does or doesn't do, can only operate when life already exists, so it cannot be used to account for life. Now that's a huge topic, and I'm not going to say I've written a book on it, even though I have.
I've got another one. Is there a multiverse, or does God exist outside of the universe? If so, where?
Yes. Outside the universe. I'm not sure what that means. You know, the simplest things we observe are the most difficult. We don't know what time is. We don't know what energy is. And we know relatively little about the universe. I believe that God exists. We ask the question, where? And of course, ideas of dimensionality, as C.S. Lewis pointed out long ago, can help us. We have our 4 dimensions of space and time. And we can imagine, certainly as a mathematician, I can imagine many more dimensions. And all of that kind of thing. But our minds completely boggle. But now the multiverse question, where does that come from? The idea of a multiverse is used by some to solve the problem of the fact that we live in an extraordinary universe that seems to be geared to the supporting of carbon-based life. And over the past 100 years, the natural sciences have revealed the extremely accurate fine-tuning that's necessary to have a universe like this one. Basic constant of nature, basic ratios, that if they're changed just a tiny bit, either the universe would fly apart or and so on and so forth. Now, Hawking called his book The Grand Design. Why? Because he notices this, and he mentions it in some detail. He said, the universe, and I'm paraphrasing again, the universe appears to have been designed with these precise concepts, and that leads some of us to the old view that the universe was the work of an intelligent creator. And then he says, but that is not the view of modern science. It would seem that this universe is one of many universes. Now that's a very interesting statement. First of all, it commits the crime of chronological snobbery, which C.S. Lewis defined to be the old view. If it's old, it can't be right. Well, I'm old, so I can't be right. That is a ridiculous notion. Basic mathematics hasn't changed since I was a child. There are lots of old things that are perfectly right, so that isn't an argument. But secondly, rejecting a creator and saying, look, the thing that explains why this universe is so finely tuned is the fact that this universe is one of an infinite number of universes, whatever that means, wherein everything that could possibly happen does happen, so it's not surprising that we live in a universe like this. And that sounds very interesting, until you begin to ask what is the evidence for it. there is no access, by definition, to these other universes. And several scientists believe in them, but there's a war in the world of physics as to whether they believe in them or not. Now, I was taught quantum physics at Cambridge by Sir John Polkinghorne, and he looks at this view and he says that it makes far more sense to him to believe in a single creator God than in a multiplicity of universes to which we have no access and no evidence for their existence. Sir Martin Rees, on the other hand, our astronomer royal, he says he prefers to believe in the universe, but that's not a scientific statement. That's simply a preference. But now what is very interesting from the theoretical point of view is, if there is a God, he can create as many universes as he likes. So you cannot pitch the multiverse against the existence of God. And indeed, one of Stephen Hawking's co-workers, who wrote several eminent papers with him, Don Page, who's a Canadian physicist, is a Christian and believes in the multiverse, simply because, philosophically, there's no intrinsic objection to God creating as many universes as he likes. And my final point is, in a book that I place great store by, it's called the Bible, there are hints that this is perhaps not the only universe that exists, but that's another story.
Right, now we're running short on time, so I'm going to combine two questions. In relation to your worldwide travels, I assume you came across a variety of belief systems. Should being born into another culture or belief system dictate our morality and ultimately our destination after death? Or are all religions pointing to the same thing? And similar question, in a society where we have access to many religions, how do we decide which one to follow? You'll start at 10.
The question is very important because it enables me to say something that relates to my first statement tonight. What impressed me with my parents was that they believed that every man and woman, whatever they believed, was of infinite value, made in the image of God. Now, it is a very common idea that religions are vastly different in the moralities they teach. That's simply not true. And if you do the investigation, and again, I was first put onto this by C.S. Lewis, but other writers have corroborated it. In a little book he wrote in 1940 called The Abolition of Man, at the back, he lists, I don't know how many, 20, 30, 40 different religions and philosophies. And in every one of them, he finds a version of the Golden Rule. The fact is, morally, there aren't the vast differences that we think. Now, of course, there are differences, but there are certain basic values that run through everywhere. Now, that's exactly what I would expect if the biblical record is true. If every man and woman is made in the image of God as a moral being, we would expect all sorts of different worldviews to come up with essentially the same morality. And that is a very important thing. Now, the first part of that was, if you're brought up, just tell me exactly what that was.
Should being born into another culture or belief system dictate our morality and ultimately our destination after death? Or are all religions pointing to the same thing?
Well, there are two questions there at least. Dictation of morality sounds a little bit like determinism to me. And one of the things that was very important to me was to answer a variant of that question. Remember, I told you the story about being accused of being Irish. Of course you believe in God. Now, what was very important to me, which I didn't mention, was to experience firsthand that it's possible for a person to change their worldview. That was very important to me. And I entered into dialogue with a mathematical friend at Cambridge, and the dialogue went on for 2 years. And at the end of the 2 years, he became a convinced Christian. And that was, for me, the beginning of a whole trail of evidence showing that it is perfectly possible to change your worldview because you believe that another worldview parallels more closely truth. Now, I did a debate with Peter Singer, who's the world's most famous ethicist. And he threw this at me at the very beginning of the debate. You can see it at YouTube. He said, I told the whole audience, which is about this size and was in the town hall but in Melbourne, I said about my parents. And he stood up and he said, well, there you go. You know, you're a Christian because your parents were. This is my big objection to religion. Everybody stays in the religion in which they were born. Well, I then asked him the question. I said, Peter, I told the people about my parents. You didn't tell them about yours. Were they atheists? He said, yes, they were. Oh, I said, so you stayed in the faith in which you were brought up. Oh, but he said it isn't a faith. And I said, Peter, I'm really sorry. I thought you believed it. Now, that is very revealing of the contemporary concept of faith, and I'm not going to go into that. But it showed that he didn't realize his atheism was a belief system, but that supreme irony came at the end when the first person who went up to greet him identified with his culture. And he was delighted to meet this person who came from his culture in Eastern Europe. And then this person said, but I have become a Christian. So the very first person he met at the end of the debate was someone who's changed their worldview. So I think it's a matter of, yes, we are profoundly influenced by our parents. And that isn't all bad. Of course it isn't. But as adults, we come out into the big world and we have to decide what our answers are to the big questions of life. And through life, that is why I've gone about opening myself to questioning like tonight. Well, what was the second bit?
The second one, in a society where we have access to many religions, how do we decide which one to follow?
Well, I only know one way of deciding which of anything to believe is on the basis of evidence. You see, there's a confusion about faith. Many people have accepted Dawkins' definition of faith as believing where there's no evidence. That's nonsense. Faith is an ordinary word. It's not just a religious word. It's an ordinary word. It means trust. And usually, I suspect that all of you, you don't trust either facts or people without having evidence, or else you're a bit silly. And your bank manager won't trust you with a loan unless you provide evidence of collateral. Isn't that true? We all know what evidence-based faith is, but somehow the word has been spread around by Dawkins and co. that faith is a vice because it's believing where there's no evidence. That's nonsense. That is blind faith, and it's very dangerous. It's the kind of faith that causes young men to fly planes into tall buildings. That's blind faith. Christianity is evidence-based. Listen to this. John, at the end of his gospel, he says, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written, that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. In other words, here's the evidence on which faith is based. Now, how do you decide between religions? Well, there are several ways. Very briefly, just think of the three major monotheistic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. When it comes to Christ, my Jewish friends, and I have many of them, believe that Christ died and did not rise. I, as a Christian, believe he died and rose. My Muslim friends believe he didn't die. Those three things cannot be simultaneously true. And therefore, I simply invite people to investigate the evidence. And one of the most seminal experiences in my life was sitting on the ground in the bright sunshine in Trinity College, Cambridge, listening to one of the world's top lawyers, actually an expert in Islamic law, but a Christian. And he was at Queen's Counsel, amongst many other things. Sir Norman Anderson, I think his book is still obtainable. And he got up and says, I want to do a forensic investigation of the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And the place was absolutely packed, and I'll never forget it, because that was the beginnings of understanding that there is a rational forensic defense of this. And we have to make up our own minds. But there's another method of approach, and it's this. You see, of every worldview and religion, I ask several questions. And when it comes to religions, I ask, what is the shape of the religion? How is relationship with God determined? So let's just confine ourselves, for sake of illustration, to God-fearing religions. Not religions that don't really believe in God and so on, but God-fearing religions, like the three I've mentioned. And what I discover by constant questioning of people is that there's a general pattern, that there's some sort of initiation rite, perhaps performed on a child, perhaps performed on an adult, and the person is on the way. And the descriptor, the way, is often used, and I often draw this, and I draw a little door, you get in, and a wavy line. This is the way it goes up and down. And then there's a gate, another big door at the far end, and I draw the scales of justice there. And at the other side of that gate is nirvana, heaven, what have you, paradise. And I say, as you're on the way, you have various people that teach you and help you and so on, but even they cannot guarantee your acceptance into heaven or whatever at the end. Why? Because you have to go through the final assessment, a judgment. And why is that? Because the principle of the religion is merit. And so you have to hope that with all the teaching you've got and all the experience, that your good deeds will outweigh your bad deeds and you'll be accepted. And I find that by and large, most people say that's exactly what we believe. And I say, it's exactly not what I believe. And they say, of course you do, you're a Christian. You believe, as well as I do, that good works are important. Yes, I say, I believe they're important, but they're not the basis of acceptance. And they say, but how can that possibly be? Well, I say, you think of that wavy line. And you're on that wavy line, and you cannot, by definition, be sure of acceptance. It's like Birmingham University. You get in, you do your A-levels, wonderful, you're in, and then there are nice professors like me teaching you, but I can't guarantee you get a degree. Why? Because you have to get through finals. That's the day of judgment, folks, isn't it? And many of you remember it. And that is what the vast majority of people think a religion is. And then I drop a little bomb into their minds. And I say, but that isn't Christianity, folks. In religion, acceptance comes at the end on the basis of an assessment of merit. Well, if that's religion, Christianity is not a religion. It's a relationship, and acceptance comes at the beginning. That's radical. And you know, I believe in our country and in my original country, many people have rejected Christianity. Why? Because they've never understood this. They don't realize that Christianity is not a merit-based religion. Because Christ came into our world and he told us that if we listen to him and accepted his word and believed on him as the Savior, the Son of God, we would have in that moment eternal life and we would not come into judgment. That's utterly radical. So the acceptance comes at the beginning. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I don't give lectures like this and discussions like this to earn God's forgiveness. I do them because I got it. That's radical. And you all understand that. Let me ram this in with a little illustration. Can I do that? Only take a minute.
Go on then. And then we've got...
This is it then.
Yeah.
You've heard about my wife. Well, over 50 years ago, I saw this vision in Cambridge. So I decided I'd like to marry her. So I came to her one day and I had a little present wrapped up for her. It was a cookbook. So I said, I'd like to marry you, Sally. Now the condition would be this. Let's look at page 147. It's apple cake. And here are the laws for making apple cake. Thou shalt take so much flour, thou shalt take so much sugar, and there you are. Now, here's the way it's going to be. If you keep these laws for the next 40 years, I'll think about accepting you. If you don't, you can go back to your mother. But look, why are you laughing? That is what many of you sitting here think about God. And you would never insult a fellow human being by basing a relationship on merit. You wouldn't. And so my marriage has been good. Why? Because my wife is not cooking in order to gain my acceptance. She likes cooking because she's got it. And the wonderful thing about Christianity is precisely that. It's not religion in that sense. It's a relationship.